right, welcome, folks. So glad you could join us, whether it's the afternoon, the morning, or you're watching from overseas during the evening. We're really excited that each of you could join us for another episode of S&G Connections. Today's purpose for S&G Connections is to unveil officially the S&G Endeavors consulting process, which we called Engaged Change. Engaged Change is what we use to help our clients create customized, community-driven change. And really, it's a process that we have developed to ensure that our clients are served in the most effective way and to ensure that we can deliver a customized process that's going to meet their needs. And so I'm really excited to talk with a couple of my colleagues today that have had some significant experience working with S&G and the process that we use. And so I want to welcome Renee, who is the previous executive director of Bike East Bay. And I'm sure at some point today, Renee, you will talk with us about what is next for you and what you're thinking. And then we'll also talk with Jennifer Hansen, who is with Public Health Solutions out in Nebraska and has had some significant experience, as many of you read in a blog post last month, leading 3 different communities through strategic plans to increase walking and biking. So Renee, Jen, both really glad to have both of you here today. How are you?
Thank you, Jeremy. It's a pleasure to be here and to get a chance to geek out about strategic planning, which is always something I enjoy. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. And Jen, how are you doing over there? And you're in Lincoln today? Is that where you are?
I'm in Hickman, Nebraska, and it's great. It's wonderful. The weather is nice. So.
I love it. Well, hopefully you guys are having better weather than we are. It's pouring rain last I checked out here. So the great old metropolis of DC with flooding weather, go figure. But it's really good to have both of you on. What we're going to talk about today is the process of engaged change. And so I'm going to start off for our viewers, just kind of going through our process, talking a little bit about how it works and how we do make the effort to customize it based on what a client is doing and trying to achieve. And then we're going to open it up for some discussion with Renee and Jen. So we will move right into that. And as John is transitioning our slides, give some kudos to John in the background, who is running our board for us and making sure that logistically this comes off great. So if it works for you, awesome. Hats off to John. If it doesn't work for you, make sure you bash him in the comments and let him know. No, I'm joking. But thanks again to John for leading us through this. And as always, if you want to submit your questions, you can do that as you're watching right there on Facebook Live, or even leave a comment for us after the fact if you're watching after the fact. So let's talk about engaged change. One of the things that I find fascinating about this episode, and I was remarking on this, I think even as part of the promo, is that S&G Endeavors has been using engaged change or a form of it since we started working in 2002. Whether we're working with a nonprofit that is creating their next strategic plan, or a nonprofit that is trying to dive further into how to launch a particular collaborative project among some different governmental agencies, or even our governmental agencies that are working to create community-driven collaboration. These are areas where engaged change really comes into play and really helps our clients take their work to the next level. So sometimes it's a retreat, sometimes it's a meeting, sometimes it's a series of dialogues and virtual and in-person meetings. The methods of delivery are quite different depending on the project that we're working with. But there's 4 consistent components that we dive into at S&G Endeavors in order to make sure that it's going to work. So first, we really work with our clients to map the process. And in fact, a lot of times in our contracts, there's even a clause that after step 1 in the process that really says we're going to come back and check and make sure that what we outlined as an initial process is still going to work as the scope for our work together. And so during that phase, we're going to get really clear about who are the participants that we want to engage. Many times I talk about system and the purpose of what we're doing and who needs to be engaged as part of the planning process. And the system, or mapping the system, is really a key to that. So a lot of times in that first phase, we're going to help the client really start to map their system of stakeholders and look at who needs to be engaged. And then that mapping of stakeholders really happens throughout the entire process. So it'll help us get the process started. It's going to identify the larger picture of where the organization wants to go, and really help craft or create what we call the design team. And that usually takes us into phase 2 or step 2, depending on how I happen to be feeling that day and how big the project is, probably is a better way to look at it. But step 2 is really about engaging the design team. This is something that Renee has done really well as we've worked with him on various projects, and really thinking about putting this holistic team together that's going to be able to drive further planning in a very holistic way. And I would say Jen has modeled that commitment to holistic representation every time that we've worked with her on leading a community together, or bringing a community together around increasing plans for biking, walking, and overall health. The design team has always played a key role in expanding that conversation and making sure that stakeholders are being brought in. During our design team phase, we really work with this cross-functional group to drive data collection. We really ask the question, what do we need to know before we can engage the whole system of stakeholders in this dialogue? So sometimes it's going to be surveys, a membership survey, or sometimes it's going to be, doing an exploration of opportunities that might exist, like we did in Beatrice with Bike Share, for example. They were thinking about bringing that in. And so we did some exploration about that or around that for the design team. Sometimes it's about interviews and focus groups. When we did Bikey's phase 2 strategic planning, I know we've really tapped into the design team to gather some focus group data and get some feedback from the community, so that when we got to that larger engagement phase, which we'll talk about in just a second, we had a clear picture of what was happening within the system of Bikey's Bay. So we were able to tap into that. The third step in our process, we call it accelerating the change. It's actually my favorite step. It is the one, don't get me wrong, I love the design work, and I think the design work, the design team work is so important to the process. But when you get to the accelerating the stage conversation, or accelerating the change conversation, it is about bringing the whole together and creating a dialogue that is rapidly paced, keeps people focused, and walks out with a clear action plan of what we're going to do to achieve the goals that we set. And it's just really inspiring to me. It's also, by the way, the part where after it's done, I start to step back as a consultant. And when we move into transitioning into action, that last step, I become more of an advisor to a person like Jen or Renee as they're leading that implementation step and really starting to move into the implementation phase. And so we'll work with a leadership team if they want, but it's really more behind the scenes, in ensuring that really that the action plans they have created in that accelerating the change phase move into actually being implemented. And I think when John and I were really starting SMG Endeavors, that was a key piece that we felt was missing from other consultants who do this work, is that focus on not just walking away and saying, hey, you've got your plan, we'll see you later, good luck, but it's really making sure to provide that expertise and that sounding board that may be needed in order to increase the likelihood that implementation will happen. So that's an overview of the process. Let me stop first and ask, John, do we have any questions thus far that have popped into our dialogue? If not, I'm going to go ahead and start. No questions. Awesome. So John tells me no questions in my ear. It's kind of weird how he just appears and none of you out there can hear him. But I want to kind of open the dialogue with Jen and Renee and ask each of you. Ironically, I was remarking that both of you have a really clear understanding of the process that we use and how we really work. But I think even for the two of you, this is the first time that we've ever laid it out with 4 words and tried to really simplify it. So I'm curious to know your reactions or questions, or if you think I should have dug deeper on a particular phase. So let's start with you, Renee. I don't know if you're having any thoughts or yeah, as you're looking at it.
No, it's great to see it laid out this way. It's very much reflects my understanding of the process. So it actually, even though I am seeing this for the first time, it doesn't feel like that because these phases are very clear parts of the process as I've experienced it when we've worked together on the Bike East Bay strategic plans. So yeah, I think it's a great articulation of what I've experienced.
See, I love hearing that because one of the things that John and I have talked about is how can we get better at boiling this down, about talking about it in that capacity. And I know, Jen, I think when we present this to your teams in Nebraska, it's always kind of a 6-step type of thing because there's a little bit more broken down pieces where we'll actually say, the design team comes together for a meeting and then they plan for the summit and we kind of divide those up. But any questions or reactions or thoughts that you're having as you see this?
Yeah, no, I think the one piece that I think maybe you could touch on a little bit is to talk a little bit about how you keep the design team engaged, sort of until that accelerating the change component. Sometimes there's, 6, 8, 10 months between those two, that initial design team meeting and engaging those initial members, and how you keep them engaged and what are some of the strategies you use to sort of get to that accelerate the change summit.
I love it. Excellent. Well, I think ideally what we want is somewhere between a 3 to 5 month period. So when the design team starts their work, especially if they're not doing a lot of data collection, but they're doing kind of some exploration conversations and things like that. So there's a couple ways that we can keep them engaged. I would say when you get to about 6 months, you have to get really creative. So I'm actually thinking.
I think 6 months has been our cap for the longest that we've gone out. Now that I think more closely about it, yeah. So. And
I think so. Part of it is you keep them engaged in planning the summit. So the agenda for the summits are the accelerating the change type phase. A lot of times it'll be a summit, or sometimes I've actually done it as two summits spread over 2 weekends, which we actually find does not work as effectively because you spend a lot of time the second weekend catching the people up that didn't make it to the first weekend. But as you look at the design team phase, one of the things that we can do is data collection. So especially with organizations, we didn't do this so much in Nebraska, Jen, in a formal way, but when we're talking about organizations that are doing strategic planning, like either a health department or a nonprofit, they're going to do things like interviews, surveys, and even some focus group participation. And so that's one way that we really keep the design team engaged. It's really about helping them collect the data and then letting them gather the data and create draft plans that they want to take to the larger community. in Nebraska are accelerating the change thing stage usually had a summit that was very based in open space. And so in that case, it was doing some review of what were opportunities that were ahead of us, kind of looking at were there pieces of the conversation that we might want to bring into a panel before just turning people loose and saying, what do you want? And other ways that we keep them engaged, like I said, is really just planning that event. So there are some logistical and promotional things when you're planning an accelerator event that will create that change in step number 3. And so I find getting them engaged in thinking of the concept of how do we promote it, and even in our smaller communities, really making phone calls and asking people to come, or hunting people down at the local grocery store or something like that. Ways that we can kind of keep them active. The rule of thumb that I use with the design team is, quite frankly, I want them selling the summit. My ask of them is, help me put the product together and then help us sell it. Because they're the best people to say, I really want you to be there. I need you to be there because we need your wisdom that you bring in the room. Renee, I was chuckling at the beginning of this because when we did the second iteration of the Bike East Bay plan, I think it was 2014 or 15, I can't remember which. But when we did that, I distinctly remember that the design team had a little bit more time to prepare for the summit, and we had to keep them engaged. And part of that was because we added this internal phase that was about going out to the community and gathering input from the community of maybe people who couldn't be there. And I distinctly remember that when you guys got to the accelerator phase, it's what kind of drove this more holistic approach for the Accelerator Summit, which was not just about creating the strategic plan for Bike East Bay, but it was about also creating some space for people to learn about what people were doing in the space of cycling and walking advocacy. I didn't know if you would want to talk about that a little bit, but that's actually, by the way, being modeled by Cleveland right now. You should know that.
Cool.
So
yeah, I went a little bit in. I mean, I think one thing I wanted, looking at the slide, one thing that I wanted to sort of add as another layer, and I think we maybe saw this because we went through the full process twice, is that, like, I feel like, you kind of put the buckets of here are the phases, but there's also a piece that for me kind of runs horizontally through the whole process, and that is, there's a piece about, hey, we're going to come out of this with a plan, right? So there's the part of creating that plan that moves through this whole process. But for me, that's kind of, in a way, it's sort of the secondary piece. There's 2 other threads that I really saw at play. One was leadership development. It's really a process, in terms of like just engaging the design team, which is probably, staff and board. It could be some other key volunteers, engaging that group of leaders and building their capacity within the organization. In terms of bringing the summit together, that's also, an opportunity to identify and engage new leaders, and also getting into the action phase. So there's kind of like this leadership development piece that goes through the whole process, and then also like an organizational capacity building piece that goes through the whole process. And for us, having gone, like the first time we did it, our capacity wasn't there to do what we did the second time around. We didn't have enough leaders. We didn't have enough capacity to really engage the community to the extent that we wanted to. So then the second time around, by having more capacity, having more developed leaders within board and staff and out in our community, the folks that we call local leaders out in the out in the cities that we work in. It's worth saying that Bike East Bay represents 2 counties, 50 cities and towns. So one of our challenges in this whole process was really reaching out to all the communities that we serve to hear from them and to find out what they're doing, find out what they want, what they need from Bike East Bay, find out what their priorities are. So the second time around, we just had more capacity. So we were able to go out and have some of those conversations. You know, the design team was able to have some of those conversations. We were able to get more people to the summit, but we also recognized, oh, we have such a big territory, we're not going to be able to get everyone to the summit. So it really is important to have these other conversations as part of our strategic planning process. And then I think, you know, coming out of that second process, again, we had increased our capacity. We had increased how many leaders we had within the organization, and that made a whole bunch of other processes possible. So, you know, I just really want to point to that this, you know, going through this process, specifically in the engaged way that we did it when we worked together, that was really bringing in the community, that is going to get you much more than just a plan at the end of the process. It's going to get you a stronger organization. It's going to get you a more engaged, developed, more robust, and larger group of leaders for your organization.
Jen, let me pop over to you because I think we've even seen some of that in the way that yours has come together at a community level. It's kind of interesting to me, by the way, Renee, because Jen works for a health department, which is the district health department. So she's dealing with the different counties and cities type of thing. And so it's kind of neat to look at the things that are comparative between the two pieces. In Nebraska, they just don't have a large enough advocacy community to drive that. And so the health department is really driving some of those. Jen, have you seen kind of that similar thing where it's building capacity and leadership and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I look at the people that, you know, showed up the day of the design team meeting, that we engaged for that. I look at them, some of them like in Hebron years later, and just look at the different work that they're doing in their community now, sort of as a result of what they experienced through this process. And I love Renee's piece about leadership development, because I just really feel like this process allows, you know, sort of for that to come out, to draw that out in people. So.
So kind of think, so it's interesting because I was going to ask a question about how did the process customize for you guys individually, and we're kind of talking about that a little bit. So Jen, what was your favorite part? Was it the design team, the accelerator part? What would you say is your favorite part, looking back on all three?
I would say probably that transition period, while it can be honestly a lot of times the hardest piece, the transition period between the energy that you get from the summit, that huge excitement, that engagement, that passion that comes out from those people, and then moving it into action. I love to watch how they sort of take on their action plan and sort of form their own, you know, their own coalition, their own sort of organization, and how they're going to, you know, divvy that action plan up, or how they're going to start addressing implementation of their action plan. Even though it can be sort of the most, honestly, for me, it's kind of scary because you don't know where they're going to go or if they're going to go. You know, they go and they take it on for themselves, and how it needs to be for their community, and how we've seen that sort of manifest in 3 different ways in 3 different communities, and yet for their community, it's right for them. So.
I think it's really interesting that you're saying that too, because I will say, as a consultant, and I'm going to come to you, Renee, next and give you some space to comment on this as well. But as a consultant, so I always make the joke with my clients, you have to trust the people and trust the process, trust that we have the right process in place, trust that we have the right people in the room. It's not really a joke. It's the theory behind what we're doing. There is never a time more critical than when I have to trust the people and trust that we've got the right process in place then right after that summit happens or the accelerator stage happens, and we start moving into transitioning into implementation. Because as a consultant, we've laid the ground, we've helped the organization lay the groundwork. And so now you literally have to step back. And I would say I've worked with about 100 and I think the last time I counted was like 160 organizations since 2002. And there are 4 that I can tell you have not made that transition the way that they were supposed to. There are always degrees to to the way that it happens, but there are 4 that I can say, looking back, they're the 4 that I want to try to figure out why it didn't happen. Obviously, that's not one of your guys's, but the fact that I can tell you there are only 4 out of that many really, I think, speaks to how we lay that groundwork for the transitioning to start happening, and for us to start seeing the organization step into action. And especially, Jen, I think looking back at Nebraska, we were doing it for the first time in a couple of the communities where we had never done that work before. And so we really had to learn how to trust that they were going to take it to the next level and they were going to respond to that action planning. So I also think it comes down to who's leading it. And Jen, you really did a good job of stepping back and creating that space. And that's one of the things that I like about you as well, Renee, is there were times when I remember you even stepping back as an ED and saying, okay, where are the staff going to take this? And how are we going to operationalize it?
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I think, and now, of course, I have a certain perspective on it because I have just departed the organization. Well, I mean, technically, I'm a few things up, but there is now a new leader, a new executive director in place at Bike East Bay, which I'm really excited about. And so kind of like, this is sort of like the thinking about it retrospectively, but thinking, oh, like my job coming in 7.5 years ago was to make myself obsolete, right? Like to leadership of the organization so that it has the capacity to move into new leadership. And I just really saw that with how we built the capacity of the board, built the capacity of the staff, and just turned this process into something that is really kind of deeply embedded in the organization. And since we did our summit in the end of, it was in 2014, adopted the plan early 2015. And then in the past year, as we were, past year or so, kind of as moving into this leadership transition phase, the staff and board actually, after having kind of completed a few other pieces, like we completed our statement of values around equity and social justice, which was a piece that we hadn't been able to fully flesh out in the 2014 summit. So that was kind of a piece that we needed to work on as an organization, and did some other work around organizational culture, and then went back to our final strategic plan. And with all of that, having clarified our values and our direction and what we really believed in and our aspirations, we went back and built all of that into a revised version of the strategic plan, which we now had the capacity to do, as a very board and staff collaborative driven process, So it wasn't, we'll probably at a time in the future go to a bigger, process, but we were able to take the next steps on our plan essentially on our own. And that also was like a big piece of just really just building the leadership of the organization. And I feel like in some ways the test was in the leadership transition, because that's often the most stressful time for an organization, for both board and staff. And that was handled just, the capacity was there for the board and staff to come together, and that, transition kind of search and transition team to go through a really rigorous process of figuring out who the next leader should be, completing that. And, you know, and I, of course, stepped out of that process, being the departing ED, and was, so for me, I was like, yes, they did it. It was there, you know, everything that we did to build that really worked. And so now I kind of like have this other perspective on the whole trajectory of our, you know, 2 strategic planning processes and a couple of other things that we did along the way to see, oh, now I have this story that's a little different. Like, oh, this is really an organization becoming mature.
That's a really interesting way to think of it, because I do think, you know, the way that we customize the process is so driven by I don't want to say, well, yeah, I think maturity is the right word, but it's where is the organization at in its process. And so even thinking about, Jen, when we started with Hebron, for example, that was our first community. It was the smallest community. You were just getting into the space, and learning more. And then as we built on, and especially the Nebraska Walkable Communities process was just being refined, what was going to work in these different communities. I think Hebron was one of the original 6. And then we added Fairbury, and it got, you know, we used the design team a little bit more effectively as we were coming into it, and we're able to tap into the power of the design team. Beatrice, when we got to that community, was kind of interesting to watch that trajectory where it was a little bit bigger city. They kind of stepped into it a little bit more, but it also created this a little bit more questioning of how does our process, you know, help them and not hold them back, and how do we make sure that we're not creating a situation that doesn't allow them to tap into their own energy. I know that was a challenge that we talked about as well. And I think it really just speaks to how do we, you know, I think for me, it all starts with that mapping and then being able to remap, right? So we check at after every meeting, how are we doing? Is there anything that we're forgetting? Is there anything that we need to add to this? And I know both the health department and Bike East Bay, as you guys went through the various processes that you've went through, you guys have been really good about that, kind of process checking ourselves and making sure that we're thinking about things from a very holistic way. Well, let me bounce it to you, Jen. Any other further comments on this one before I move on to start moving us into a different direction? Jen
Nope,
or Renee?
Nope.
Okay.
Sounds good.
So both of you kind of represent, and I get this question a lot, you know, well, who are your target clients? Both of you kind of represent, Renee, you're representing more of the nonprofit advocacy, nonprofit driven side of things. And Jen, you're kind of the government driven, but community collaborative type of conversations, right? And so it's, there's different viewpoints that you guys are coming at it from. Ironically, both of you have had the processes that we use have helped to create safer communities for biking and walking. And so my question to you is it just biking and walking that this is a process that can be used for, or like, how do you think that the engaged change process might be applied in other avenues or other sectors or things like that?
Yeah, for me,
go ahead, Renee.
Yeah, it's not specific at all to biking and walking, though it works really well with those communities because people there tends to be like a pretty broad constituency of folks who care about those issues. So whether you're organizing it from the advocacy side or organizing it from the agency side, you're going to be able to engage a bunch of people who have a really strong sense of ownership around their streets. So I think it really lends itself, the biking and walking work really lends itself to this model because you're really going to be able to bring people together to talk about a vision for how we're going to make our streets safer, because like everybody cares about that. So I think, yes, I think it works well. However, I would say whenever you have kind of a community, and it could be, I'm thinking of an organization that I'm on the board of, which I'm actually not going to name, but it has a community. It's like a meditation retreat center that has tens of thousands of people who have come through in the last few years, who feel a sense of ownership about this place that they've, you know, spent time at. And in this case, the, you know, decision of the strategic planning design team was to not do an engaged process, was instead to do a very staff-driven, consultant-driven process. And I honestly think that was not the right decision, because it would be the right decision if you didn't have this engaged community that cares about your outcome. But if you do have that, I think it's super important to engage them and not to just inform them of the strategic direction. So that was a place where, with all the experience of what we've gone through, I felt it was really the wrong choice. You know, it's a very different kind of organization and community, but nonetheless, it would have really benefited by bringing the people who really care about the place together with an open process, you know, kind of like the open space that work that we've done, and really genuinely ask the question in real, genuine two-way communication, which is what I think the open space model allows for. I just think if you have people who are invested, believe in them, you know, believe in them, bring them in, ask them real open questions, don't present them with a baked cake. So it's just something like I'm really personally passionate about. And I think there's probably organizations which maybe have a very strategic focus, but not a real defined community or constituency, where it would make sense to do a more board staff consultant driven strategic planning process. But I think if you have a community and you're doing your strategic planning process and you're not asking your community what they need, well, I think you're doing your community a disservice.
Well, and even if you're trying to engage to create that community, kind of thinking, Jen, from your perspective, we weren't sure that the communities were all there yet, but this really helped to even bring them into the process and to get their buy-in.
Yes, absolutely. And I will echo that. I mean, I think this process is, you know, like Renee said, anywhere where you're engaging community members, anywhere where they have a say, or they where they care about their community or what's going on with it. You know, from the beginning when we rolled this process out for walkable communities, I thought to myself, why are we not using this in, you know, talking about nutrition and things that impact, you know, a wide variety of people in our communities when we're trying to touch the lives of those people? Why are we not incorporating them in these decisions? And then also just it allows me to let them do a lot more work and to let them take on a lot more of the responsibilities for improving their own health and for improving their own situation. When I am seen as the health department coming in and saying, this is what you've got to do, this is what you've got to do, this is what you've got to do, it, you know, it doesn't work so well. So the thing I love about this process is that, you know, it ignites the passion and it gets more people moving on it in a cohesive manner. And you're just able to get so much more accomplished that way. You know, we are doing a similar process for our community health assessment this year for the first time. In the past, it's always been a staff-driven, a 1 or 2 person driven process, and it's been cumbersome and, you know, honestly taxing on a lot of our staff. And this year, we're able to sort of, we're engaging the community. We've kind of tagged it that this is the community's project and not just our project, that this is a comprehensive, that we want voices from every inch of the community to be a part of this, so that the priorities that shake out for our community health assessment are truly representative of the needs of the community. So
I think that's really critical, and that's one thing that I think both of you and your organizations do really well, or well, Renee, your previous organization, but I think it's one of the things that you guys do really well, is really teasing out what are the needs and how do we best meet those. And I think so many times, this is something that I've been thinking about, because we just completed strategic planning for Two Rivers Public Health Department, and did some work a couple years ago with the City of Chicago Green Corps program. And both of those really were about thinking about, what does the community want? What do they want to see? What's the direction that they want us to take? And to really open yourself to that question. And I think one of the things that I've noticed is there's such a desire sometimes to think that we have to have all the answers. And the leaders that I see really accelerating change within their community have really said, I don't have to have all the answers. I have to have some good ideas, and I have to bring the right people together to give me even more good ideas, or even better ideas that can take our work to the next level. And I think both of you have led organizations and communities to have those conversations. And I just really thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to come to you for final thoughts in just a minute. But I do want to take a moment to just thank Renee and Jen. Each of you contributing your valuable time to this conversation, I think, is going to be a help to our clients and our potential clients, and hopefully to even your colleagues, as you think back on the awesome work that you're doing. I do want to give a shout out to Nexus for Change and G1NBC, who are promotional partners and who promoted this to your audiences. It's always really important to me to think about how we can bring the knowledge of what we do and better talk about what we can do. And even just having this conversation today has really helped me focus in on some of those added benefits, like what you were talking about, Renee, with capacity building and leadership development. I know that those are benefits, but it's really interesting to just, you get so used to saying you're going to get a strategic plan and you'll get more engagement, and those things that people feel like they can quantify specifically. And just to have you talk about those is really very helpful to me in the work that we do. So I thank you both for that. So Renee, Jen, take us out. I'll give you a couple options to choose from. Number one, knowing now what you know, is there anything that you want to make sure people involve in their process as they're going through this? Or the second question is there a reflection that you're having on today, or any last minute wording that you would want to leave our audience with when thinking about engaged change? And so let's see, we'll go to Jen first and then Renee.
Jeremy, first off, I just want to thank you for, this experience has taught me so much already in my career. It's just opened my eyes to possibilities that I'd never even imagined before in working with communities. So thank you. The thing I want to echo is just what you always say: trust the process. When you have a solid process, you can trust that process. You can always go back to that process and trust the people in the room. And I think that's it.
Awesome. Okay. Renee, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I just also want to say thank you so much for having me on, and this has been a great conversation. I just wanted to highlight one thing that I feel like we could do better, but we could have done better at Bike East Bay and in general in the walking and biking movement, and that is who we're engaging. I think as I look around at a lot of these processes and other places with other groups, I still see us predominantly engaging more affluent white folks in these processes. They're the people who often, kind of volunteer to come forward, and I think sometimes we make an assumption that they care more about their communities, and I don't think that that's the case. And as Bike East Bay has kind of made more efforts to get out into low-income communities, communities of color, Spanish-speaking communities, other, engage people in other languages, we find they care a lot about their communities and their streets and safety, and often they're the ones most impacted by streets that are not safe. And so I just feel like as a movement, this is a place where we really need to step up our game, really figuring out how these summits or other kind of accelerators are accessible to the most people, regardless of what language they speak, regardless of, their childcare needs, work schedules, etc. So I don't have the answers around that. I just wanted to kind of actually throw it out as a final challenge around how we can keep doing better.
I think it's a great challenge. It actually is. It's a challenge that I am seeing a lot more in the work that I'm doing. And so I think it might even be fun, Renee, when you and I check in here shortly, let's kind of even start talking about that. And maybe that's even a facilitated dialogue online where we tap into what has been working.
Yeah.
And do some,
too.
Yeah. Hold some dialogue on it. So let's definitely do that. And I think it is something that's coming up in everything that I'm doing. I've got organizations from a health department to a nonprofit bicycle advocacy organization that are having conversations around how do we do a better job of engaging people of color, people who speak different languages. Even in Nebraska, we have that conversation going. And so I just want to call that out because I think I didn't realize until I started working in Nebraska that there was a larger community of color that exists in some of our smaller cities across the state. And so I think that it's worth calling out that even in what is primarily a high population of white in the state of Nebraska, we're still seeing that. And I think I'm not sure if that hits any of the three communities that you're working on, Jen, but I know it hits more in the center of the state. So awesome. Well, thank you both again for joining us. And thank you to everybody for joining S&G Connections. We want to make sure that this is an interactive conversation for you that's going to help you better understand what we can do to help you, and also gives you some learning along the way that you can take away and be able to apply the next day when you go into the office and start talking with your team about how you want to approach a particular topic or discussion, or even planning activity, leadership development, or building your organization's capacity, whatever it may be. Next month, we're going to kind of do S&G services. So we're going to talk a lot about the services that we provide, try to give you some general understanding of the different services that we have available. We're choosing August to do it because it is typically a vacation month. And so be sure to tune in live from the beach. You can even send us pictures of your beach excursions as you're taking your August vacation and tuning in to check out S&G Connections, and think about how when you get back to the office, we may be able to help you, your team, or your organization, or even community take its work to the next level. So stay tuned to our Facebook page at SG Endeavors if you do a search on Facebook, or you can just do facebook.com/SG Endeavors, and you'll find us there. Be sure to like our page. We don't have a lot of likes. I think it's because we've never really done a good job of asking our friends. So please tell your friends to like us on Facebook, like us on LinkedIn. We're available, and we want to do our best to engage with you and help map the change that's going to take, or the process that's going to create the organization to the next level. So again, thank you to Renee and Jen. for everything that you guys do in your communities. And I look forward to many more times of working with each of you. A big thanks to our promotional sponsors, Nexus for Change and G1 and BC. Huge thanks to John for running our board, and Jerry, our special projects manager, who is doing his best to try to manage me and manage our projects. I'm sure that both are not easy to do at the same time. So thank you to everybody, partner consultants for S&G Endeavors, and hopefully we'll get more conversations going along the lines of tapping into the different expertise that we can bring to the table. So thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Renee, I'm looking forward to talking more about how we dive further into that challenge, because I think that that is a perfect opportunity. So thank you both, and have a good day.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. Have a great day.
All right, thanks, everybody, and we'll have John take us out.